Agradezco a la distinguida ministra para Asuntos de Género, Su Excelencia María Arnold de Suecia, por su declaración. Y ahora ofrezco la palabra a nuestra segunda invitada, la profesora Gita Sen, de Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DON, para que responda a las observaciones formuladas en el debate y haga sus propias observaciones sobre el tema prioritario. Tiene la palabra, profesora.
Muchas gracias, señor. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. And I'm going to try avoiding wearing my professor's hat, although I must say there's a great temptation to do it, because like a good professor, listening to everyone, I kept thinking, okay, do I agree with this? Do I not? What are they not? What have they left out of their answer sheets in this exam that I need to point out? So I'm going to try and not be professor, but I can't resist talking about some of the things that I think that we really need to emphasize. Having said that, let me just start by saying something about from the civil society side. 15 years ago, when the MDGs came onto the scene, there were a number of people who, from the perspective of civil society, said MDGs stands for the most distracting gimmicks, because they're distracting us from what we, in fact, spoke about during the conferences of the 90s. They're too narrow, they're too reductionist, and there's many things that we're leaving out because of the focus of the 8 goals. Now, I think that in the 15 years since then, we've learned a great deal about the fact that, in my own sense, that belief is not an accurate one. We have, in fact, gained a great deal by the focus on the MDGs. And yet, listening to all of you today, what kept coming out when people spoke about gaps and challenges were exactly those things that were in the conferences of the 90s and didn't get into the MDGs. And let me mention some of them. It's fascinating listening to what people were saying. Violence against women. Was it there prior to the MDGs? Yes, it was a huge debate in the 1990s in Cairo, in Beijing, let's not forget, Vienna. That is when violence against women got put onto the agenda. And yet it disappeared because once we moved to talking about the MDGs, it just sort of submerged itself to where women's organizations were speaking about it until, of course, the events of the world forced the issue back onto the agenda. We can think of a number of other things. Care work, the importance of care work, and the relationship between care work and women's ability to participate in the labor force on equal terms. That was very much a focus of our discussions in Beijing. And yet, that was another one that disappeared in the meantime. The very important issue that I want to come back to about political equality in decision-making and constitutional guarantees for gender equality. How do we ensure that gender equality, in fact, is written so deep into our legal systems, into our constitutions, into our institutions, that they cannot be frittered away with vagaries of different governments coming and going? That was very much part of our discussions before the MDGs came in. Crucially, the question of monitoring and accountability and data that many of you raised was another one of those that, in fact, was a big one that we spoke about at that time. So let me, having sort of said yes, but no, in terms of that question of whether the MDGs were, in fact, distracting or not, speak about what I would call the 7+1 crucial things that I think we must keep in mind as we move forward towards the post-2015 agenda. First, women's access to resources and land. it's not enough to speak about, for far too many women, it's not a matter of participation in the formal labor force. They are still primarily workers on land, and for them, access to land, access to the resources to make use of that land, credit, technology, and so on, is absolutely critical. Without that, it's very difficult for these women, of whom there are a very, very large number in the world, to move forward. Secondly, the interrelationship between women's participation in the workforce and women's responsibility for what is called the care economy. And it has sometimes now been called the importance, and I think it's in the Secretary General's report that it was very well put, that in terms of the care economy, we need to think about how it can be recognized, reduced, and redistributed. The 3 R's for care. Recognize it, first of all, reduce it, that is, reduce women's burdens in it, and redistribute it. It will have to be shared across within the home and between the home and larger society, social responsibility. The third element is human development broadly. Although we've made some advances in education, primary education particularly, we know that major barriers in secondary and tertiary education in many parts of the world, in fact, come from gender inequality and gender biases in society that make it very difficult for girls to progress beyond the primary level to secondary and tertiary levels. So the importance of recognizing that, the importance of recognizing access to water, to sanitation, and to healthcare more generally, not just as women as recipients of those services, but women also as the primary people responsible for providing those services to families and communities. And when governments don't step in to support women's ability to do that, those burdens become quite, in fact, killing for women. Very, very difficult to hold. The fourth one is the famous one of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Let me disentangle this, because this has now become a jargon which some people intend to mean one set of things, and other people shut their ears when they hear the words. Let me just say what it means. It means very simply this issue. When my daughter is 9 years old, or 10 years old, or 11 years old, what does she think about and what can she look forward to in her life? Is she, at that point, able to look at her brother and say, I can see a future ahead of me where my body will not be used as a basis to determine what I can do with my life? Will it be one where, in fact, I will be safe, I will be able to resist and avoid violence? Will it be possible for me to control what happens to my body so that I can, in fact, participate in other aspects of life, so that I can go to school, so that I can, in fact, become a politician, so that I can become a professional woman? Where does all this come in? Inability of girls and women to control sexuality and reproduction, to prevent the violence that often is inbuilt into sexuality and reproduction, to recognize the fact that to be full human beings for women, this ability is critical. This is what is meant by those terms, sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And we must understand them in the way in which they evolved in the 1990s, why it was that violence against women was the first thing that got recognized in the Vienna Conference on Human Rights. Let's not forget, it took 40 years after the Human Rights Declaration for violence against women to be recognized as a violation of human rights. And it's important, I think, that we recapture what those intrinsic meanings were and stop treating this language and these words as though they are some bogey that we are terrified of and cannot use and cannot acknowledge. I think it's crucial. Let me just say here, when I think of these words, I think about my grandmother, who lived to the age of 90, and who, if she had lived in a world of gender equality, would in fact probably have been one of our India's best diplomats, and maybe even better, an international civil servant. Who knows, maybe the Secretary General in fact, because she was brilliant. She was a brilliant woman. She was married at the age of 9. That was the end. Everything she did after that was circumscribed by that fact. And for far too many young girls, that's what sexual and reproductive rights, or the abrogation of sexual and reproductive rights, means. I think about my mother, who would have been a great doctor. All her life, she has wanted to be a doctor. And she has a brilliant healing touch. Anything she does in that field, however, is informal, because she was married at the age of 14. Okay? That's the world that we want to change for our children and our children's children and our future. And that's what, ladies and gentlemen, is meant by sexual and reproductive health and rights. So let's understand it for what it is, why it's so critical and crucial for girls and women to be able to have access to it. Let me carry on. The fifth of these is, of course, violence against women, of which we've become very aware at this point in time. The sixth and the seventh are two things that we did include a little bit in the MDGs, but not enough, far from enough, and which I think has been spoken about eloquently by our Egyptian colleague, by our colleague from Tunisia, and interestingly, by our colleague from Denmark as well, all coming at the same thing from their different perspectives. But in fact, the importance of firmly anchoring non-discrimination and gender equality in legal and political systems, in constitutions, so that they are not left to the vagaries of political change as and how they happen. And I think that this will be crucial for you and for us together to look at as we move forward. And the last one, which is no less important than these, is what kind of macroeconomic and ecological and military-free environment are we thinking about when we think about achieving all of these previous 7? Because if that macroeconomic environment is not conducive, if our ability to attain, to take seriously climate change, to mention just one, and to deal with ecological problems is not adequate, and if we are not able systematically to reduce the militarization and conflict of our societies, then all of those previous 7 will have no meaning at all. And therefore, that +1 that we must look at is as important for us in thinking about gender equality. And I would here call upon both high and low-income governments, countries of the so-called North and countries of the so-called South, to recognize that we have mutual responsibilities in this regard. Countries of the North, I call upon you, brothers and sisters, to recognize the interdependence and indivisibility of all human rights, that we must have economic justice in the global world, that we must have economic and climate justice in the global world, if we are in fact to move forward to those elements of those 7 elements of gender equality that I know you all recognize. On the other side, I would call upon brothers and sisters from the economic South to recognize that just harping on economic and climate justice without recognizing failures in the area of human rights and gender equality and equality and non-discrimination for all persons is not adequate either. We must put our differences in this regard aside and come together because, in fact, we're thinking about a future that is not, I know I will not live to see that world, nor will most of us here in this room. But it's a world that we owe to our daughters and our sons. It's a different world, and it's a world that we have an opportunity to recreate now. We need to get out of our entrenched positions and really use this opportunity to come together to make the transformations that we need. Thank you very much.